You've made the big decision. It's time to make the move west. The movers have carefully packed your three-bedroom house in Independence, Missouri, and have headed out on their cross-country journey. You've got your plane tickets for you and the three kids, and you're off on your next adventure. A couple of nights stay in a hotel in Sacramento, then time to unpack. A week later, and approximately $15,000 out of pocket, you're safe and sound in your new home. Congratulations, you survived an incredibly stressful life event. Now let's turn back the clock to the early 1840s. What would that move look like, and how much would it cost? Let's start by looking at your moving van. This is it, a typical farm wagon. It's about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. In it you have packed all your worldly possessions you want to take with you, plus enough food for you and your kids for at least 5 months, plus clothes and bedding for the trip, plus all the cooking utensils and tools you will need along the trail. Remember, if your moving van breaks down, you have to fix it. If you are lucky enough to be financially secure, you might even have 2 wagons. But like the vast majority of the over 250,000 pioneers who made the trip west between 1840 and 1869, you probably could afford only one. Before we start our journey, let's see how much our move will cost. Many people think that the pioneers simply packed up their wagon and headed west, but it wasn't quite that simple or cheap. Before we start, let's see how much a dollar was worth when you migrated west. On average, between 1840 and 1846, a dollar was equivalent to approximately $39.50 in purchasing power today. For our exercise, we'll round that to an even $40 to make our calculations a little easier. Now let's look at some of the cost of your approximately 2,000-mile move. According to most historical sources, the cost to move your family from Missouri to California ranged from about $500 to $1,000, depending on the size of your family and what resources you might already have available. This translates to about $20,000 to $40,000 today. That may sound high when compared to our estimate of $15,000 to make the move today, but we have to consider several different factors, such as the advancement in industry and technology that have occurred over the last 180 years, plus the shift to a services-based economy where we now leverage the resources of others. Now let's take a look at some of the elements that make up that cost. This chart shows 5 major expenditure groups for your move. If you were lucky, you already owned a wagon that was adequate for the journey. All you needed was a farm wagon, but it had to be strong and sturdy. And maybe you owned enough oxen to pull the wagon, but it's doubtful since most farms didn't need teams strong enough to pull a heavily laden wagon on a regular basis. If you didn't own a wagon, then you were looking at around $300 for a new one in the early 1840s, or about $12,000 today. You would need at least 2 yokes of oxen. A yoke was a team of 2 oxen, so you would need at least 4. They were relatively cheap as compared to mules, but still, that's about $4,000 in today's money. Food and supplies, including some number of cows or sheep, would cost about $300. Or about $12,000 today. But that wouldn't last you the whole journey, so you were betting on finding game and other sources along the way. Tools such as shovels, axes, chains, anvils, saws, hammers, and such would cost about $100 or $4,000 today. And finally, on the trail, you would need to replenish your supplies or replace oxen that died, were stolen, or simply ran off. Another charge would be for ferries to cross rivers. You could try to cross yourself, but normally it was better to bite the bullet and pay the fee, typically $1 to $3 per wagon, and there were lots of rivers to cross. In total, your trip was going to set you back about $1,000 in the early 1840s. If you were single, or maybe it was just you and your spouse, you might be able to get by with less expenditures. Regardless of the approach, heading west was not a decision to be taken lightly. And once you were on the trail, predatory pricing was not unusual. Taking the optimal amount of food and supplies with you was critical. Too much, and you overburdened your oxen. Too little, and you were at the mercy of the fur trappers, merchants, and trading posts along the trails. In 1841, John Bidwell of the Bidwell-Bartleson party reported that a cup of sugar could not only be bought, but also traded for $1 in the Green River Valley. While you were often at the mercy of the traders on the frontier, you could also take advantage of any extra supplies you might have. But the trading was usually one-sided. The merchants demanded cash for their goods, but paid the immigrants for their supplies only in merchandise. This could leave the immigrants in a bind later in the journey if they needed to buy additional supplies. Thirst-crazed gold rush pioneers were known to pay exorbitant prices for water, and a horse without shoes wasn't much good on the trail. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Why were prices so high for the early pioneers? Well, it boils down to basic economics. In the early days, it was simply a matter of supply and demand. For the pioneers, it was a matter of life and death once on the trail, creating critical demand of which settlers easily took advantage. And early on, there were no economies of scale. Nobody knew what the optimal supply chain looked like. So it was a hit and miss proposition. And there weren't any services as we know them today. You simply couldn't go out and rent a wagon from your local U-Haul store in the early 1840s. Financing your move west was a life event for the vast majority of pioneers. If you were lucky, like James Fraser Reed of the Donna Reed Party, you were financially able to fund the trip, even to the point of having custom-built wagons made for the journey. But for most pioneers, it came down to selling everything you owned, your farm, your livestock, and often your treasured keepsakes. Or you borrowed money from your friends and family, hoping to one day pay them back. And often, immigration companies were formed in which shares were sold on margin, in return for which you could get supplies at a discount. But even then, you still had the burden of repayment facing you at the end of your journey. And for what? This is a question that has been examined by hundreds of scholars for almost 200 years. Ultimately, it came down to a chance to find a new land that held the hopes and dreams of the thousands of pioneers who made the journey west.